Good evening, everybody. That's a good. I want to call the May 24th, 2018 meeting of the Vermont Nuclear Decommissioning Citizens Advisory Panel to order. My name is Kate O'Connor, and I'm chair of the panel, and I'm a citizen member. And what I want to do is go right down and have us all introduce ourselves. And we do have one new member, Michael Root, who is representing the town of Vernon. And when we get to Michael, maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself.
Is that you, Michael?
Yes.
David Andrews, representing the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, Local 300, the men and women of Vermont Yankee.
Representative Laura Sevilla, appointed by the Speaker.
Hi, my name is Chuck Schwer. I'm with the Agency of Natural Resources.
I'm Katie Buckley, and I'm the designee for the Agency of Commerce and Community Development.
June Tierney, I'm the Commissioner of the Department of Public Service.
Derek Jordan, I'm a citizen member appointed by former Speaker of the House, Shep Smith.
Jim Matto, also a citizen member appointed by former Senate President John Campbell.
David Dean, citizen member appointed by the former Speaker Shep Smith.
Michael Root, appointed by the Select Board of Vernon, lifetime member of Vernon. I was in the military for 12 years and I worked for the post office.
Corey Daniels, Decommissioning Director of Vermont Yankee.
Good evening, Mike McKinney, Entergy.
Kate? Yes, the people on the phone.
It's Bob Gustafson from New Hampshire.
And is Bill Irwin on the phone, Tony?
Yes, I am, Kate. This is Bill Irwin. I represent the Agency of Human Services. I work for the Vermont Department of Health.
Great. Thank you, Bob and Bill. And if any time you want to chime in, please do. Tonight's agenda, as everybody will see, is shorter than usual. We usually meet until 9. There is a chance we can get out by 8:15. So we'll see. The first order of business is to approve the minutes. I don't know if anyone had did anyone get, Tony, you sent them to people, correct? Yeah. I don't know if anyone had a chance to actually read them. Do people feel comfortable that they had a chance to read them? I don't know if there are any corrections or changes, or somebody would like to make a motion.
Make a motion to approve.
David Dean has made a motion to approve the minutes. Commissioner Tierney.
I will second the motion.
Okay. All those in favor of approving the minutes of the November 16th, 2017 meeting, please say aye.
Aye.
Anyone?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? The minutes have been approved. And first up on our agenda is Joe Lynch, who's going to give us the Entergy decommissioning update.
Thank you, Kate, and good evening, everyone. The next slide and next slide. As you know from past report outs, the focus at the site is primarily associated with dry fuel storage. We have a project that's both loading fuel as well as constructing what will be the new site protected area around the ISFC. As far as the dry fuel loading campaign, to date we've loaded 33 casks in the current campaign. That gives us a total of 46 out of 58 stored on either of the two ISFC pads. We're working on cask number 47 as we speak and expect to have that loaded shortly. So that will leave 11 casks remaining. The target and our goal has always been to have all of these casks loaded by the end of 2018. However, with the current schedule, we should be and could be complete by the end of September in the event that we don't run into some issues that we can't anticipate right now. At the last meeting, I talked fairly extensively with Corey's help about an issue that was identified within the industry having to do with similar casts as the design that we have from Holtec. That particular issue identified at another plant that a device called a shim standoff, a small leg at the bottom of the shims that hold the rack in place inside of the canister, was found broken off at another site. So we went into a campaign of inspecting all of our casts to make sure we didn't have a similar problem. We did not find that problem, but it did cause a delay in the dry fuel campaign, but it was one that was done appropriately, safely, and smartly. So we took that penalty of several weeks, made sure that we didn't have the issue. That's now behind us, and we're moving forward at a rate of about 1 cask per week. So again, back to the progress that we were making before we identified this issue. As far as the reduction of the site protected area, as I had mentioned in the past, we're in the process of constructing a new protected area around the independent spent fuel storage installation. That construction has been progressing since November of 2017. With the success of kind of the weather balanced with a good project management team, we were able to make considerable progress through the winter, and that project continues on. We do need Nuclear Regulatory Commission approval of these proposed changes because it impacts our overall physical security plan. So we're still awaiting those approvals from the NRC. However, the progress of the construction along with the loading of the fuel again has us expecting to complete this by the end of 2018 or sooner, to either support our transition to Safe Store 3, the next phase of Safe Store, or in the event that the transaction with North Star is approved by both the state of Vermont and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, it would support that as well. Next slide. Kind of hard to see, but here's a current picture of the combined ISFA-C pads and the canisters. The majority of those, of course, are loaded, but a number of those are standing by waiting for the last 11 casts. So as you can see, the pads are considerably full. Next slide, please. And these are a couple current photographs of the independent spent fuel storage installation protected area. And then that blue building in the picture on the left-hand side is going to be the new central alarm station. That building will house all of the equipment that will be monitoring the dry fuel storage casks. We do have some instrumentation on there. It'll also be where security will have their station, so we'll continue to have 24/7, 365 security coverage going forward. But as you can see, we're making very good progress, and we're on or ahead of schedule with that part of our project. As far as water management is concerned, to date we have shipped 757,000 gallons. The next shipment is scheduled for June 14th. We've continued to see the benefits of the modifications that we've done to the turbine building to slow down the rate of intrusion into the building. Currently, we're a little over 500 gallons per day. This primarily has to do with seasonal variation, so we would expect as we move into the summer, we'll see a slow and stable trend downward. At least that's been the history, and that will help, of course, the amount of water that's shipping off-site. And we continue to ship that water to Entergy Solutions, which is a licensed disposal site in Tennessee. Some new information is as we get ready for transitioning, unfortunately, the next phase of our employees onto their next career later this year, we've already started working with the Departments of Labor in Vermont, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire to provide them with a number of information sessions and training for things like resume writing, small business opportunities. There's also some benefits through what is known as the Trade Act, which will provide them with training opportunities, potential relocation if they find jobs in their area of expertise. So we have enjoyed a really positive relationship with the Vermont Department of Labor, Massachusetts, New Hampshire. I have attended a couple of meetings myself just as an observation, and good interaction between the agencies, lots of great information. It was just noted that at the former Marlboro Graduate Center, there is an office now set up so they can come in and get resources for things like computer searches and resume copying, that type of thing. So very local to the area, there's excellent resources. So that will continue on through June into July, and there'll be many opportunities for employees to reap those benefits, hopefully. Next slide, next slide. In regards to the proceedings before the Vermont Public Utility Commission on the transaction docket 8880, some of the recent milestones since our last meeting, the Vermont Public Utility Commission had issued a series of questions to the MOU parties. Those answers and responses were provided on May 4th. Conservation Law Foundation was given some additional time. They provided their responses on May 9th. That led up to the evidentiary hearings in Montpelier. They extended 3 days, May 10th, 11th, and were completed on the 14th. So all of the hearings before the commission are complete. The upcoming milestones, all parties are due to file their proposals for decisions or initial briefs. Those are due on June 11th, and then once all the briefs have been filed, each party will have an opportunity to file what is known as reply briefs. Those are due on June 25th. At that point, the Public Utility Commission should have most of the information, I think, that they need to render a decision, and that decision will come sometime in the future at a date that is based on their needs for reviewing all of this extensive material. Next slide. As far as the parallel approval path with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, we did submit along with North Star for a license transfer application back in February of 2017. Since then, the NRC has been reviewing that application. They issued what are known as requests for additional information. One of them was late last year. We provided those answers along with North Star. A second set of RAIs were issued on April 5th, and those responses were provided on May 21st. So now the NRC will go back to completing their review and render a decision on the license transfer application, and that's expected later this year. And then finally, an update on the Nuclear Decommissioning Trust Fund. Last time I was here, I reported at the end of April, the balance was $552.5 million. I'm sorry, the current is $552.5 million. Since the beginning of the year, which was $581.5, we've had $17.8 million in qualified withdrawals, about $5.7 million due to negative market adjustments and fluctuations. We paid about $5.5 million in taxes or fund expenses. We also provided the annual report to the NRC on March 31st, giving a summary of where we are with the trust fund at the end of 2017, so we met that milestone. And then finally, the second trust that we provide an update on is the Site Restoration Trust. I reported at the last meeting that we have paid in the $5 million payments, $25 million, which was part of a MOU and settlement agreement back in 2013. Currently, that trust fund stands at $30.9 million, so that's seen about $5.9 million in growth since its inception. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Joe. We're going to have Commissioner Tierney will give us an update on the state of Vermont, and then we'll take questions.
So I don't have much to add to the description that was just given. We are at a place in the case in docket 8880 where the process is coming to a close. Briefing is underway right now. I think a couple of details I would add are that the PUC, excuse me, the PUC posed a few questions in writing after the hearing, and the nature of the questions was principally about what would happen if North Star were to file for bankruptcy. And so that is a matter that we are now actively reviewing and preparing answers on. I would also add that the Public Utilities Commission is asking itself whether it ought to stay its decision until the NRC has made a decision, or whether it ought to answer that question by going first and then having the NRC make the ultimate decision about this transfer. As you will recall, this is an unprecedented transaction, so those sorts of wrinkles tend to crop up. So we will be preparing an answer to that question as well. I think that's all I would add at this point. Oh, one more thing I'd like to note. Neither Attorney Kyle Landis-Marinello from the AG's office nor Attorney Steph Hoffman from my office are here tonight. Both of those attorneys distinguished themselves, in my opinion, in this litigation, and they have taken new positions elsewhere. So we do not have the benefit of their services anymore. However, at least speaking for the department, as you perhaps are aware, we also had retained the services of Wilmer Cutler, a very well-reputed law firm in Boston who has been working on this matter and representing the department and the people of the state of Vermont in this proceeding all along, and the attorneys of Wilmer remain on the case.
Thank you. Now it's time for anybody on the panel who has any questions or comments about Joe or Commissioner Tierney's. Representative Dean. Wait, you have to use the mic. Thank you.
Oh, you got to turn it on too. You don't have to. Yeah. Oh, okay. When you fix those braces in the cast, I'm just curious, how far into the cast did you have to go? Did you get into a highly radioactive? I mentally, it's probably an oversimplification, but I see the cast as being like onions with different layers of protection. How far in did you have to go?
So the casts are brand new, so there's no radioactivity at all involved with inspecting the casts. The casts are about 11 feet in diameter, about 18 feet tall. Unfortunately, these legs are at the very bottom of the shims, these little devices that hold the rack in place. So, Corey, please help me out here. But they involve using remote cameras, special equipment that can get down to the bottom and view all of these little standoff legs to ensure none of them are broken or.
So you didn't go in and tap them with a hammer. This was remote.
So yes, we performed visual inspections using cameras. We did not have to repair any of our shim standoffs. Okay. We did not find the same thing that was found.
Yeah, I was just wondering what level of exposure personnel might have had or whatever.
Yeah, these were all brand new from the factory, and we inspected them on site. In fact, some of them were still at the factory and inspected before they were shipped to the site.
In terms of the reduction of groundwater entering the turbine building, in your remarks, you really only reference seasonal variation, and you would expect it to go down as we get into the dry part of the year. But are there additional constructed activities that are going on to reduce that seepage into the building?
Yeah, so if you recall, when we first discovered this, we had report outs of water coming in 2,000 to 3,000 gallons per day. And over the course of the last 3.5 years or so, we have done a number of sealing activities. We've identified areas where water came in. We either sealed those areas off or did modifications to the building and its structure to slow down the amount of water coming in. But as I also reported, this building is 30 feet below grade and groundwater levels 15 to 18. So the building's under a constant hydraulic pressure. Water will kind of find its way into the smallest areas, but we've seen, upwards of an 80% reduction in the overall intrusion rate. And we continue to look for ways to improve that. I mean, our goal is zero.
My question was into the future. I'm aware of how much you've reduced the inflow, but you only referenced a reduction into the future due to the seasonal
Right.
reduction of flow, and I was curious if there were some other activities that you would undertake into the future to further reduce that flow.
Yeah, we still are working with a number of firms that specialize in both the sealing activities as well as coming up with the solutions. And I don't know if we have anything right on the horizon, but if there's ones that we can get to that are cost effective, we'll absolutely continue to try to drive that down.
Right, and you would report that back to the
Absolutely,
panel.
yeah.
We would. We're currently evaluating several estimates and proposals to determine if it's worth pursuing additional activities for sealing locations. It's values of the target that are challenging, as Joe mentioned. It's the aggregate of many, many, many very small leaks, so it's a difficult process.
Okay, and then one last question. You said that the NRC has issued a second request for information. What kind of information? An example, just so, you know, did they ask you about the cosmos, or did they ask you about leakage in the building? I mean, I don't know what that statement meant.
Sure. The request for additional information has to do with their approval of the transaction, and it was primarily focused on financial issues, primarily focused on North Star. So
Similar questions to what the commissioner related to us about what the PUC is asking.
No, the questions from the NRC were more about whether North Star could realistically rely on recovery of litigation proceeds from the Department of Energy for failure to take custody of waste. And that's a component of North Star's calculation here, and they're questioning that.
Okay. Thank you.
So, thank you. Joe, same topic. I noted goal is 0 on the groundwater. But my question is, when will you stop shipping groundwater offsite? What would be the trigger to stop shipping?
You know, essentially, it would be zero in leakage, or get to a point in time where we can either collect and evaporate faster than we can ship off-site. So we ship 5,000 gallon shipments, you know, roughly several times a month based on the intrusion rate. But we don't have a significant storage capacity. We have one what's known as a frac tank. I think it's 20,000 gallons. So at any point in time, we can only hold about 20,000 gallons. So in order to maintain that storage, that's what drives the number of shipments. So unless we get down to 0, we'll be doing it maybe less frequently than we are right now, but I see it into the foreseeable future.
So I appreciate that answer, but what would cause a stop? So presumably you would have to, what would cause you to have to be able to stop?
Well, as Corey mentioned, we still have a small number of areas that are leaking into the building that need attention, so we'd have to seal up all of those additional areas. That some of them are, you know, if it's just right in the middle of the floor, we could seal it very easily. Some are in building joints, some are in trenches, some are in areas that piping passed, so it's not easily get to. So we have to kind of look at, you know, a cost balance there to see if it costs $1 million to seal it up, but only saves, you know, 100 gallons you know, a day, you know, what's the cost benefit? That has to be kind of factored in.
So if you're not able to get it to 0 on site, you'll continue shipping for as long as there's groundwater being produced that can't be.
Right. Yeah, and unless if the transaction goes through and North Star starts to go into active decommissioning, they would have other methods for maintaining and controlling groundwater until that building is properly dispositioned and filled in, and then, you know, that would be obviously some years into the future, but not that far into the future if everything goes according to their proposal.
Okay, so Kate, may I follow up with a question for the commissioner then? So is that, and I don't know if this is a question that I can ask or not, but is that conversation as part of the transaction?
It's always a question you can ask because this is America. My view of this would be that this is not part and parcel of the transaction. The water at issue has contaminants in it, and that's where we start getting into one of those areas about what our authority is. We do manage this, and I'm happy to have Tony speak with you. Tony Lashinsky, the department's nuclear engineer. He can give you our assessment of the progress of water seepage and shipment, but it is not something that we directly regulate.
I guess what I'm trying to understand is whose responsibility it will be to take water off-site, and at what point, groundwater off-site, and at what point that stops. And am I hearing that the responsibility shifts with the transaction?
It would be whoever holds the license for the plant.
Or I would answer that more directly and say yes. North Star is stepping into the shoes of Entergy, and that includes all of its obligations.
And Commissioner, are we asking North Star these questions as well about groundwater, and how long they plan to monitor?
That is not something that we are doing in the context of the transaction, to my knowledge. I don't think it belongs in that transaction discussion.
So if I could just weigh in, and I agree with Commissioner Tierney that the radiation part, we don't necessarily have the authority, but from the Agency of Natural Resources perspective, we're concerned about groundwater contamination for non-RAD. And as in many sites that we are addressing in cleanup, whether or not you pump groundwater or contain it or do other things really depends on, after you characterize the whole site and understand it, then you figure out the proper cleanup plan, which hasn't really been done for this site yet, to know that, maybe it's diverting clean groundwater, maybe it's pumping groundwater and treating it on site. These are all things that I'm sure will be evaluated, but I can say at least from non-RAD, they haven't done that work yet, but we envision we will, and North Star has presented some initial plans for how they'll characterize the site that, in our opinion, looked pretty robust.
I would add something to that too, and that is that the site itself will be the subject of a site characterization study, and that is very much a negotiated point in the transaction. But the details that you're drilling down into are the kind of thing that one would deal with after that site characterization study has been had.
Okay, so this will be a point that is addressed prior to a transfer?
No, not prior to the transfer. It's something that will be addressed as a term of the transfer. The transfer contemplates that there will be a site characterization study. The transfer will occur if the PUC approves it, and then a study will be conducted by North Star, and this issue will be dealt with in that study, to my knowledge.
The other thing I can add, Representative, is that water management is part of the cost estimate for doing decommissioning. So it's always anticipated that any decommissioning site will have a certain amount of money set aside to manage water. So that is part of our cost estimate, and it's part of North Star's going forward.
Okay.
I believe Bill Irwin has a question, and then I have one after. Bill?
Yes, thank you. So I am pursuing the same issue here. I think it would be very valuable for the panel to consider at a later point in time some discussion of what will become of water that is currently dammed up by the structures there and making gradual intrusion into the buildings, because when the demolition begins, that water will flow differently, obviously, and there are potentials for significant contamination there. And it would be very valuable for members of the public as well as the panel to understand how that will be monitored as well as how the water will be controlled.
different topic. Different questions.
Yeah, water question, just to clarify, Joe, is the next water shipment scheduled for June 14th or for June 4th?
June 4th.
June 4th, okay,
Thanks.
thank you.
Well, Commissioner Tierney, one thing that we're not allowed to talk about, though, is safety, as we all know, right? So that it is America, but we're not allowed to talk about
Well, to
safety.
be clear, it's America, and that rule has been made in America.
Yeah.
But I take your point.
Just back to the water issue, do we have a dollar figure as to how much the cost of shipping that water off-site has cost so far? And is that coming out of the decommissioning fund?
I don't have a current figure. It's in the ballpark of $4 a gallon, last I knew. And I don't know what the source is for payment. I can certainly research both of those for you.
And is it, whatever it is, being paid out of the decommissioning fund?
I don't want to speculate.
Okay.
All of the costs have to go through a process of being screened through, evaluated whether they meet the criteria of coming out of the trust fund, and then the monies are either paid out of the fund or not.
Okay.
And I just don't know the answer to that.
Okay, back to casks. The current casks that are there from before, those are a different kind of casks, so those structural issues did not have to be applied to those older casks, or are they same model casks?
There's the ones that were discovered at another site are slightly different design than ones we used at Vermont Yankee, and we were not able to duplicate the issue that we were informed by Holtec about at this other site. So each site's casks are kind of called the same system, but the design is specific to the fuel at those sites, so there are variations in the design, even though they're the same Holtec System 100, as it's called. I don't know the design differences between the other site and Vermont Yankee, but the important thing is that we weren't able to duplicate the problem, able to move on with our loading campaign.
So there was no analysis required of the older Holtec casks?
There was a root cause evaluation done that included not only the design of the ones that we have right now, but any ones that had been loaded in the past, to make sure that we could say safely that all loaded fuel does not have this issue that was identified at another site.
Yeah.
That was part of the reason it took several weeks to get through that.
To augment Joe's answer, the causal analysis that was done for the gas, that particular issue was found at another facility. The differences with that, coupled with the highly representative sample of all the shim standoffs we were able to inspect, and that was 100% for all the ones that are left. We have full confidence that we don't have the same issue, even with the gas that were previously loaded of the design that we're using at Vermont Yankee.
Okay, thanks. My final question is regarding the NRC's approval of the proposed changes to the physical security plan, i.e. the actual perimeter line around the ISFC. When do you expect that determination? Before the other approval or after?
We would need the NRC approval before we can declare the new area operational, and I never speculate on when NRC is going to approve. We ask for a certain date, so we ask for a date coincident when we want to make it operational, but the NRC works to their own schedule. Sometimes there's those questions back and forth, but I know they're in the midst of reviewing it as we speak.
Is it a necessary prerequisite to the license transfer approval by NRC?
Kind of de facto, because part of the transaction is that we will, as part of the arrangement with North Star, provide fuel loaded on the pad in a protected area. So I guess you can say indirectly it is.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for safely moving that fuel from the pool into the cask. This is very good news that you might be finished before 2018, and I appreciate your professionalism and expertise in doing so.
Thank you.
Evening, Joe. You had mentioned the revised security for the site into the future. I'm just curious, I think you may have shared that at a previous meeting, but I don't remember. Is that security just around the dry cast? And the only reason I ask is as we're contemplating if the sale were to go through and future inspections from state representatives for the decommissioning work, I'm just wondering if the work is going to remain inside a secure area or outside. Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, so the area around the dry fuel storage will have one certain type of security. There still will be a security perimeter around the industrial portion of the site, so people are not going to be able to just walk in. We obviously have radioactive material that is under our control, so there are regulations on what type of security. So vehicles will still have to be screened through. Individuals will still have to have a badge to enter into that area. They're just different security requirements for the fuel versus the industrial footprint of the site.
Thank you.
All right, seeing no other comments or questions from the panel, I'm going to ask if anyone in the public has any comments or questions on the presentation from Joe Lynch or Commissioner Tierney. Seeing none, we're going to, oh yes, please come up and please tell us who you are and where you are from. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, finishing my supper here. A couple of questions that came up for me, Joe. It's okay to call you Joe. I'm Betsy Williams. I'm from Westminster, West Vermont. Two things. One was if you can talk, and it's kind of a follow-up on the last question, give us more detail about what's meant by a secure perimeter. What is that? A fence? Razor wire? What is it? And how big an area? And when you say that that blue building that's going to be a monitoring station, can you talk more about what the nature of that monitoring of the casks will be?
So generally when we talk about security, a lot of that information is what they call safeguards. So I don't even have a lot of detail, but in general, the barrier around would include fences, it would include razor wire, it would include cameras, it would include electronic equipment that can sense people and things moving. Very, very significant concrete blocks. If you were to tour the plant today, you can see those physically. Those are vehicle barriers, so vehicles can't, progress past that point. As far as the central alarm station, the new building, it will have all kinds of equipment that tie back into it so they can monitor all of the security equipment that has been installed as part of the new perimeter. So again, the details of what it includes, I don't even know because it's part of our physical security plan. So when we submit things to the NRC, it's done in a non-public way because it has all that information for obvious reasons. And then when they send the approval back, only people who have the right safeguards qualifications can receive that information, and that's generally our security and people that have the clearance. So I'd like to be more specific, but as you can imagine, it's very high-tech equipment, some of the most sensitive equipment that you would expect for protecting the materials that we have.
Can I just ask, just as a follow-up, does any of that monitoring directly connect to the casks themselves so that it's actually monitoring what's happening with them and if there's any, God forbid, any degrading of the material or anything like that?
So to the best of my knowledge, and I'll phone a friend if I have to, we monitor temperature. So we monitor electronically the air temperature that goes in at the bottom of the cask and then the air temperature that exits the top of the cask. We have a specification of what that should be. So if you see a change in the temperature, it could mean there's something going on, either a blockage or something like that. And then I think we monitor radiation by hand. We actually go up and physically take radiation readings along the various elevations of the cask. We provide that information in a report. I think we send that to the state of Vermont as well. So the two things we monitor is temperature and radiation. And those give us indications of anything that might be going wrong with the casks.
All right, thank you. We're going to move on now to our, hopefully, discussion and possible approval of our annual report to the legislature. And then I'm going to throw it over to David Andrews to give everybody an update. A group of us went up and met with 2 legislative committees that involved Representative Sibilia and Representative Dean. But first, I don't know if anyone has had a chance to look at the annual report. Jim, to his credit, had 2 suggestions at the last meeting, which I didn't pull out of the file folder until an hour before this meeting, so I apologize. I will tell you what they are. On page 1, line 33, where it talks about the NRC coming and talking to us. His suggestion was that we clarify that they are representatives from the NRC. We have their job titles, but it's really not specific. So we thought that we should make that clearer. And then on the last page, page 4, beginning on line 154, which is the meeting schedule, this reflected that we were going to meet on February 22nd, and Jim's suggestion was we just put an update saying we delayed that meeting until March 22nd due to the ongoing negotiations with the MOU. So those are just really clarifications. And I know David Dean had, and I'll throw it over to you to bring this up, but I believe it was line on page 4, the water management issue that you wanted to put some more in there about the groundwater. Is that correct, Representative Dean?
Yeah, I think I was talking, I'm sorry, I think I was talking about the minutes, not about the annual report.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
And I got over that, that's why I made the motion to.
Okay. All right. So does anyone else have any comments or suggestions about the written annual report?
Kate, this is Bill Irwin.
Hi, Bill.
Hi. So on page 2, lines 54 and 55, I'm a little confused as to whether the name Kyle Landis Marinello was left out there relative to Attorney General, or if Steph Hoffman is both Attorney General and attorney at the Department of Public Service.
Yeah, and actually I failed to say that Jim found that same thing. So we're going to put punctuation.
Oh, I want credit for this.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you were the first one to say it to the group.
There we go.
Yeah. So what we're going to do is fix the punctuation there. With a couple some periods and some commas. I think we'll fix that.
Great, thank you.
I just had a comment to thank you for preparing the report.
Actually, I want to give credit to David Andrews.
I just have a comment to thank David Andrews for preparing the report. It's an outstanding product.
Does anyone else on the panel have any suggestions or comments about the report that we're going to submit? What's up?
Sorry. I continue to think that particularly the chairmanship of the NDCAP panel is really, as a volunteer position, places a really difficult burden on anybody who would be seeking to do that job. And if there's any agreement about that on the panel, I think it might make sense to include some provision that says that the panel feels that there needs to be some compensation or some administrative help beyond which has currently been the case. I know you're stepping down as chair, Kate, and I'm really concerned about who's going to come next and who's going to be able on a volunteer basis to really provide what you've been doing all along.
Yeah, and I think if it's okay with you, if we can postpone that discussion until later on the agenda, because I have a discussion just about that. And because at this point, this is an annual report for 2017, so I think we need, at least my opinion is we keep that part out of the annual report, but we can discuss what we want to do as of September. Is that okay with you, Lissa? Because it's not in anything we discussed in 2017.
I guess if you didn't discuss it, that's probably correct, but I know that you've certainly felt it during 2017, so that's up to you, Kate, but that would be my recommendation, is to include something.
How does anyone, David, do you want to mention something here?
Yeah, a couple things. The purpose of the report is to inform the energy committees of what's going on, and part of the intent there is to is by providing them that education early up. If there's any actions that have to be taken in Montpelier during the legislative session, they can. And what we've typically found is if we wait until the end of the year to do the annual report, then we approve it in January, February. By the time it gets to Montpelier, we're kind of late to the ball here. So I would suggest, and it's really coming right around the corner, is that for the 2018 report, that we set a cutoff date of perhaps September 30th, after which we prepare the report. And that way the committee has time to review it, amend it, approve it, and get it into the hands of the folks in the State House before they actually reconvene, when it can do them more good.
Oh, yes. Representative Dean.
And I could be proven completely wrong on this, but this panel is not, even if Laura were to sponsor legislation next year to, in fact, make resources available to the panel, et cetera, that isn't how it's going to happen. It's going to happen through Commissioner Tierney's budget. That's where, or Secretary of A&R's budget, or a CCD. It's not going to happen because a legislator introduces a piece of legislation. So I think, and I agree with the chair, that maybe we should defer this for a full discussion later, but we should maybe be extracting some commitments from the administration representatives who are here, who are about to get into building their budgets that they will present to the legislature for next year. And I think, I'm not suggesting that Laura shouldn't introduce legislation next session, but I think it would be much more effective to have it built into the governor's budget proposal.
So I am coming from a place of deep respect here. The topic right now is the 2017 annual report. And it sounds to me very much like we have a conversation ahead about these important issues, but it does not belong here.
We do have an agenda item for later during the meeting about what we're going to do moving forward. Yeah, Jim.
I agree with that, but Chris Campen isn't here, so I think we should note that he brought this up probably a half a dozen times in 2017. So it was discussed, it is appropriate, and so let's deal with it firmly when we do.
And just to Dave's point, I don't really look at this report, maybe I'm wrong and you can correct me, but I don't really look at it as just what we did this past year. I think it should also offer some perspectives potentially, and it's fine that it doesn't now, but maybe for next time, about whether the panel in fact has been or is being successful in carrying out its mission and carrying out the intention of the legislation that in fact created the panel. I think that's perfectly appropriate and almost necessary for the panel to comment upon, and I do think part of that analysis does involve having some form of financial resources so that we can have expertise and time to actually grapple with some of these issues. But I defer again to Kate and about not including it in the 2017 report.
Anybody else have any comments or questions? And do people feel prepared to approve the report with the corrections that I spoke of, that Jim and Bill Irwin brought up? How do people feel?
I would move that we submit the annual report as amended or as corrected.
David Dean has moved that we approve the annual report as corrected. Does anyone want to second that?
I second the motion.
All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Anyone opposed? What we'll do is we will make the corrections to the report, and we will forward a copy to everybody here on the panel. We will forward it to the legislature, and for the public, we will put it on the NDCAP webpage that is on the Department of Public Service website. Yeah.
Sorry to be a nudge, but just regarding the 200 to 300 gallons per day and the water management, that quote, that end-of-year rate of 200 to 300 gallons per day, is that an average? Because I know it was a lot more for a lot of the year, and the current rate is 500 to 700, gallons per day. I'm just wondering where that figure came from.
That figure came from the end of year, the last report from Entergy reporting that that was their end of year rate,
Okay.
as it states.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Okay, we're going to move on, and I'm not sure how in-depth a discussion we're going to have on this, but this came up, in fact, Chris Campney brought it up, is that in docket 6545, all the way back in 2002, there was a mention of spent fuel, and this is where we're getting into the conversation we're going to have on spent fuel. It's, and I'll read it for people, that ENVI, which is Entergy Nuclear Vermont Yankee, agrees that it must use its commercial best efforts to assure that the spent fuel is removed from the VY site in a reasonable manner as quickly as possible rather than stored at the VY site. ENVI shall allow the department to participate in the discussions with DOE that involve VY site and to participate in the decision whether to pursue the discussions or to litigate. And the department in this case is the Department of Public Service. The agreement was signed in 2002 by Christine Salambier, who was the commissioner at that time. And the question is, and I don't know if Commissioner Tierney, wants to address this now, or do we want to have a conversation later, is how does the department or the state of Vermont see its role within that part of the MOU? So I don't know if this is a conversation we can have now or later.
Well, the item's on the agenda, so it of course is something that we can discuss now. I don't know that there is a lot to discuss right now. To give the panel comfort and the public as well, I am aware of the obligation. When this order was entered, I actually was a staff attorney at the department, so I'm quite familiar with docket 6545, though I did not work on it myself. The provision is there for a reason, obviously, but my view of the moment would be that this is not the first issue that we're dealing with right now. The focus of our resources is very much on the transaction and whether it will be approved or not. But the department's role is, I think, fairly well spelled out in this provision. And it very clearly contemplates that the department will be able to participate in the decision-making that if the transaction and the conveyance to North Star comes to pass, it would be the conversation that that North Star would be having with DOE, the Department of Energy, about continued storage of spent fuel on site. In other words, the provisions there, this is one of several others that I would expect North Star to be stepping into Entergy's shoes on, and the role of the department is spelled out then in this language.
Yeah, David Dean.
Just a background question. As you're the licensee, are you still, I don't know how you do it, suing DOE for not taking possession of the high-level waste? And will that fall to North Star? And I know it's a fair amount of money. If it is flowing, where does it flow?
So we are continuing with litigation against the Department of Energy for the costs associated with eventually construction of the second pad and purchase and loading of all the canisters that will be going onto the two pads. I would expect in the future, North Star, if they became the licensee, would then have the ability to also sue DOE for the costs of maintaining the fuel, including security and all the other things going forward. So we are going to continue to engage as long as we're the licensee, and I would expect North Star would do that into the future until they meet their contractual obligations to take the fuel.
And how does that tie into that language in this document? I don't quite understand.
I understand. And you're teeing up for me the eternal challenge of my being in this position. I am the commissioner of the Department of Public Service. I am not the attorney for the Department of Public Service, but I'm going to reach into my precious store of legal knowledge just a moment to represent to you faithfully that I would read this MOU as wherever you see ENVY, you now insert North Star. And please don't sue me. You and I, we're getting along so well, Representative Dean.
Is any? Oh yeah, Jim.
Just a quick thing that just made me think of the litigation that you talked about, Joe. If I understood correctly from the past, and my memory may be all wrong on this, but Entergy is itself seeking reimbursement of additional expenses that it made, not only from the trust fund, but in addition to monies that came out of the decommissioning fund that otherwise wouldn't have. Is that correct? I guess to David's point about where does the money flow? Does the decommissioning trust fund and Entergy, are they both owed money by DOE?
So for the transfer of fuel from the spent fuel pool to dry fuel storage, Entergy is privately financing that. So we've taken out loans, probably not the exact term, but we have lines of credit and we take money out. I think it's $145 million. And then once we get the monies back from the DOE, whatever portion of it, we would essentially pay back those loans, pay ourselves back. There may be costs in the future that would be taken out of the trust. If those costs were to be acquired through litigation with the DOE, we would pay the trust back. But at this point, we're privately financing the transfer of the fuel. I'm not aware of what percentage of costs for maintaining the pads and having security are taken from the trust. Again, that's not something I came to prepared to talk about, but I can find out for you.
Well, yeah, if you would, because I think you just said that in the past it was Entergy's self-financing of costs that shouldn't have been there, as I guess the point of it, if DOE had taken the fuel, and then there was no additional funding taken from the trust fund that otherwise wouldn't have been needed had DOE taken the fuel in the past. Going forward, there may be some maintenance issues. Did I get that right?
Well, all I can speak for certain is that the costs that are associated with moving the fuel as privately financed, we'll get those monies back and pay back the banks or however we got those. Up to this point and into the future, I'm not sure what percentage came out of the Nuclear Decommissioning Trust. But I can say if we did take any, we would then pay it back with the monies from the DOE. I just don't know how, up to this point, we've structured that.
Is that something you could research for us and let us know?
Sure, absolutely. Yep.
Thank you.
I would just say, just to fellow panel members also, the NRC's just issued their draft decommissioning rule. And I think a big part of something we might consider commenting on in the future is the use of the decommissioning fund, which we took issue with initially and we were overruled by NRC. We should revisit that potentially if we make comments regarding their rule as it relates to the use of the decommissioning trust funds for other plants in the future.
Anyone else on the panel? Does anyone in the public have any questions? We're doing sort of a very specific discussion right now about the spent fuel, and that's what's in the docket 6545. And then I'm going to outline what we're thinking about talking about spent fuel things in the future. So does anybody have any specific questions or comments? All right, thank you. Next up is on the agenda, it says panel discussion on spent fuel management issue. Then it says how the panel would like to tackle the issue moving forward. In coming up on the June meeting, we have a representative from the Department of Energy who's going to be calling in to talk about spent fuel and the transportation issue. We also have the representatives from Senator Leahy's office, Congressman Mulch's office, and Senator Sanders' office who are going to come and talk about what's going on in Washington related to the spent fuel issue. We are trying to see if we can get the Vermont members of the Vermont-Texas Compact Commission, see if we can get one or both or three, including the alternate, on either here or on the phone with us. And the Issues Committee met, and I can have anybody on the Issues Committee there who wants to weigh in, and we're just trying to figure out where people want to go with this discussion. And are we getting the people into our meeting that you want to hear from, or what is our role as a panel in this discussion about spent fuel? And I don't know if David or somebody on the Issues Committee wants to add anything to what I just said about what our discussion was.
We realized this was going to be a tough nut to crack because there's the people we want to have come speak aren't people who are normally here, but it's an important topic. So we decided we'd kind of split this up as much as we could between May and June. So this is kind of a 2-month, two-part discussion here. Recognizing that we normally don't meet in July and August, so we didn't want to carry this forward into a couple of months, but to compress them all in the same time. But the general theme is what are our thoughts and what are the plans specifically for the spent fuel at the site, as it relates on the shipping off-site, interim storage, permanent disposal, leaving it here. It seems like there's been discussions around the edges, but it was time to actually attack it head on. This is different from most discussions we've had because we're not looking to come up with a position or take a vote or anything. This was about the panel having people come in who can educate us and inform us of the facts and try to get rid of some of the suppositions and biases and try to get down to the brass tacks of what's going on. We've never really done this before. We're kind of charting new territory here.
Sorry, does anyone on the panel have any thoughts about how we want to deal with this? Lisa?
I think that the Issues Committee's discussion about the panel having a position or getting more knowledgeable about what's going to happen with the spent fuel has to do with the promises being made about the transaction with North Star, allowing for considerably expedited redevelopment of the property. And what I was sort of am grappling with is how fast will that property be able to be redeveloped if the spent fuel, in fact, is sitting there for another 10, 20, 30 or more years, which is sort of the pace at which DOE and the repairs to our rail lines and the development of an interim site and progress on Yucca Mountain. All of that is so dependent on everything that's going on at a federal level now, which is all in play in Congress. There was a bill passed just less than 2 weeks ago that would reconfigure the whole plan for spent fuel. It hasn't been revisited since 1987, essentially. So I thought it was important that we understand where that nuclear waste, essentially spent fuel, high-level nuclear waste, is going to be going and when. And up to this point, it's been really difficult, I know, talking to Kate, to get an answer from the Department of Energy, because there really isn't a plan right now. So the idea of bringing up this discussion was to say, well, this panel did in fact take a position about supporting interim consolidated storage, which did require a change of law that is now being considered as part of this legislation on the table in Capitol Hill. I think we just need to understand what that means to want to pursue interim consolidated storage, to have the waste moved as quickly as possible. What does as quickly as possible mean? And all of those different questions. And I'm really gratified that we're going to be having the congressional delegation, the federal delegation, and at least on the telephone, DOE. That's a real milestone. I know you've been trying to get that commitment for a while, Kate. So that's really the thinking that was behind trying to address this issue more thoroughly.
I think I'd just like to support your idea, but basically once we have a better understanding of what's involved with and what are the options and what's, people in Washington are doing with and thinking about interim consolidated storage, it'd be very appropriate for this panel to take a position, or at least a vote, and advise the governor and legislature about what that is.
The only thing I would add is that we are not limited to advising the governor and the legislature. I think the national delegation ought to hear our position also, be able to carry that message into that discussion and debate.
Absolutely, because
I
now it
didn't
goes to the
understand that
Senate.
last remark. Could you repeat it again, please? I heard our role is not limited to advising the governor or the legislature, and I couldn't understand the rest.
Oh, that we in fact should, whatever position we evolve as a panel that we can get consensus on, we should inform our national delegation as well.
Does anyone else on the panel have any thoughts? And are you?
Kate, this is Bill Irwin.
Hi, Bill.
It's a little bit broader than the point relative to high-level waste, but I'm at a meeting in South Carolina, and I met with a woman named Li Ing, I-N-G, L-E-I-G-H is her first name. She is a representative for the Vermont-Texas Compact, and we were talking about the next meeting of the Low-Level Waste Compact Commission, which is going to be held in Vermont. And I have some details which may be useful to people broadly interested in the Vermont-Texas Compact for both low-level waste and potential options in the future for high-level waste. They're having their annual meeting this year in Manchester, Vermont. It's going to be Thursday, October 11th, and it's likely to start at 8:30 to 9:30 a.m. They're working on the final details, but they'll keep me informed of that. I asked if there was an opportunity for her or others, maybe the two commissioners from Vermont, to address the handicap, as there would be great interest in that. And she indicated that she certainly is glad to do so at any time. So it doesn't have to be in October, but that is one availability for not just this panel, but members of the public, to get a better sense of things broadly with regard to the low-level waste compact.
That's great, Bill, thank you. You made the connection at the right time. Does anyone else on the panel have any comments about our future discussions on spent fuels management? Let's stop.
I think Sarah Hoffman heads up the National Spent Fuel Collaborative.
She's on our list too. I meant to mention her, yes.
Yeah, and I just want to, just one other point about this. I mean, you know, there is some legislation that Representative Welch also supported that would actually give financial compensation to communities that kept the waste until a permanent repository is available. So that's just something that the town of Vernon should really know about. If there's a legislative effort on the table that could bring millions of dollars annually in for keeping the waste safely stored in casks on site until there is a permanent, not an interim, not a temporary repository. Maybe that's something that we should hear about. You know, the mayor of Zion has been traveling around the country talking about this legislation. There is some interest, and it corresponds to sort of what the federal government has done with base closings in terms of giving federal compensation to sites that are doing that job. So in other words, instead of creating a temporary site like Waste Control Specialists is going to build and keep the waste there temporarily, ship it across country, only to have to move it again at many more billions of taxpayer dollars going to waste, it's kind of interesting to consider what it might mean to have those taxpayer dollars going to compensate the town of Vernon and the larger Brattleboro area for potentially storing the waste here a little longer. And that's just the kind of thing that I think we should just have the facts about.
And when I asked the congressional delegation to come, I actually mentioned that to Congressman Welch's person. And I've had a conversation with Josh Unruh, who's the chair of the Vernon Select Board, and they're very much aware of that legislation. But you're right, we need to all understand it better. And hopefully in June, we'll get more info on that. I think, did Senator McDonald, did you want to mention something?
Yes, I perhaps should have asked earlier, but when Mr. Lynch was speaking about how they keep track of the temperature of the casks to see if the temperature goes up, what do they do if the temperature goes up?
So if you don't mind, I'll help Joe answer that question. The design of the cask and the heat removal system that's developed into it, there's really only one way that the temperature of the cask can go up, and that's if there's a blockage of the ducting that provides the airflow through it. We take immediate action to ensure and validate that those ducts are cleared.
What? Immediate action? What does that mean?
It would be to explore visually what the ducts, in fact, the condition of them are, and if they need to be cleared by any means necessary, do so. High pressure water, they're monitored daily visually anyway, so it's very unlikely that they would be blocked. We have seen instances in the wintertime with heavy snow and ice where they start to have icing, and we've monitored them both with the temperature instrumentation and pursued active efforts to keep them clean as well.
Is there any record in the United States of casks getting hot and having failed?
None that I'm aware of, and none with the whole tech cast design that we have employed that I'm aware of either. You maybe answer that, Joe.
None that I'm aware of.
So if one did get hot and you were unable to lower its temperature, what would the corrective action be at that point?
I think we have a set of procedures that are provided to us as part of the CAS design, call them emergency procedures that go along with them from Holtec, and there's different actions that have to be taken. So something like that, we would refer to the procedure that says if you're seeing temperature increases, here are the things you have to do. But these are very simple devices. You know, it's a stainless steel container that has the fuel in it. It's a vacuum dried, inert gas welded cover, and then it's put inside of an overpack with an annulus that allows the air to flow around it. So there's really not a lot that can go wrong with them. I do know that when I first started in the dry fuel storage part of my career at Yankee Row, they didn't have screens blocking off these things, so we were getting literally birds building nests in there because it was a warm place for them in the wintertime, so the casts had to be modified to put in the screens. Now that's a built-in part of it. But there's not a lot that can go wrong with them because there's no moving parts, there's no motors or any sort of devices that move the air along. It's all natural circulation. So, but there is a set of procedures for things that are anomalies that could potentially happen. That was part of the original design. I would have somebody like Holtec, talk through, some of the things that they've considered in their design.
So, just Madam Chair, as long as we're going to be discussing this issue, what's the lifespan of a cask sitting out in the open? How many years does one expect it to be serviceable?
I think Dr. Singh at NDCAP several years ago said they're designed for over 100 years, or I think he might have said hundreds of years. They're licensed for 20 years, and then they're relicensed based on a submittal to the NRC, condition, inspections, how they're maintained, but they're designed for many, many years of service. And I would have to go back and look at the record, but I think Dr. Singh said well over 100 years.
So the first casks that have been used here on site are in their second decade now?
Not yet. The first cast, well, I guess they would be. They were initially loaded in 2007, so we're coming up on the second decade, yes.
Yep.
Thank you.
Anyone in the panel have any last thoughts or comments on the sped fuel management issue? Yeah. Corey.
I would just add to some of the detail that Joe was explaining about those abnormal operating procedures and your question about what else you would do. There's a significant amount of flexibility built into the strategy, but it would include things such as cooling the exterior of the gas with water and taking extra efforts to remove temperature with the use of water and flowing water on the gas. It's really an unlikely condition, and I don't believe anybody has ever entered the condition where they've had to employ those extra efforts.
Yeah, and I think, Tony, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but when Senator McDonald asked if there had ever been incidents where the temperature had risen, you were saying nothing that you had knew either. Is that correct?
I'm unaware of it.
Yeah. All set.
In the several decades where I've served on this panel, most of what we are discussing today are things that we were told wouldn't come to pass. So when we have someone tell us something and tell us it's not going to come to pass, there's not a real good track record on that sort of thing. We were, when the approval to provide to permit the unloading of solid waste into casks back in '03 or '04 so that Yankee could finish its 40 years of operation. We were told that we didn't need to worry because the casks would be gone. And everybody on the panel said that that was an unrealistic expectation, and we were told by the then chair of the Department of Public Service that our policy in Vermont was to accept what the NRC said at face value. And no sooner did we begin to unload onto the casks, we had been told that the life of the casks were 20 years. That was the NRC rule. The rule was 20 years. After we began to unload into casks, the NRC changed its rule to, after 20 years, do another 20, then another 20, and up to 100. So when we take testimony about what to expect, I'm a little bit jaded because the testimony that we receive when we make the decisions that we make turns out to be inaccurate. We asked for the uprate to increase the contribution for decommissioning. And the NRC said it was not necessary, that they had enough money to do the job. When we asked the NRC 2 years ago, and we asked them who was responsible if North Star goes bankrupt and the money isn't there, the NRC said they wouldn't speculate. So that's when we have these discussions. It's sort of theoretical, but the information that we get year after year, decade out after decade, turns out to be incorrect. And then we are appointed to recommend what we should do, given that our past recommendations have failed because we've been operating on information that turned out to be incorrect. So that's what we do on this committee. We listen to testimony, we thank people for their professionalism and their expertise, and then 10 years later, we struggle to decide what to do now that the information we received turned out to be incorrect.
Are there any comments from anyone else on the panel on this issue? All right, we'll put together a list and keep you posted on who's going to be coming to the June meeting. Right now I know it's DOE and the congressional delegation, and if we get the compact people or Sarah Hoffman, I will let everybody know. Next up is the discussion Lissa started, which is the panel organizational issues moving forward. And as everyone on the panel knows, because I emailed you this, and this is what prompted this discussion, because I want people to start thinking now. My 4-year term ends at the end of August, and I have decided not to ask the governor to reappoint me, which not only means there will be a citizen seat, because the governor has 2 citizen seats, I am one of them, but it also means there needs to be a new chair in September. So I figure we might want to start having a discussion now, and then follow up in June, because September is going to come really fast, and I didn't want anybody to be left blindsided. I have talked to Martin about this, and he does not want to be chair, so I don't want everyone to get excited that Martin's all ready to go, because he's vice chair. And I don't know, there may be more turnover on the panel. I don't know if there are people on the panel that want to talk about whether they're going to stay now, or that can be a conversation they want to have in June. What Tony and I and Chris Campney did the other day was sit down, and we're developing a list of sort of what has evolved, at least with the job as the chairs, what the tasks are that I've taken on as chair, and tasks that other panel members have taken on as well. The sound system is all transported and set up by David Andrews. We also have made a list of what Tony does, because I think it's, there obviously has to be a chair of this panel. So I think somebody going in needs to know this, or everybody needs to look at it and decide how they want to move forward. So, we can have as much of that discussion as you want tonight, and people can think about it, and then have another discussion at the June meeting. But unless we meet in July and August, the June meeting might be my last meeting, which means has to be an election either at the end of the June meeting or at the September meeting. So, and Martin's not here, so I guess we could vote him in as chair now. I promised him we wouldn't, but. So I don't know how people, what kind of a discussion people want to have now, or how you want to approach moving forward. David?
So how do you top that one? So yeah, there has been some discussion about, this seems to be a near continuous discussion going on about the ancillary duties. Everybody remembers for some time there was the discussions about minutes, and that was one of the additional unpaid duties that Kate had taken on. And that's, in recent months now, that's become a discussion. Is again, the PA system is something that's brought to the site, and it is set up at each meeting, and that's now an issue. As everybody knows, I'm a member of the IBEW. I'm appointed by the business manager for the state of Vermont to represent the workers of Vermont Yankee. And as the plant goes away, so too do the jobs, mine included. And at some point in the end of the third quarter, beginning of the fourth quarter, I'll be a former employee of Entergy Vermont Yankee, because there conceivably won't be an Entergy, but if there is, the work will be done, workers will be laid off, and I'll be one of them as well. So I'm making the notice as well that the September meeting will be my last meeting, and after that they'll not be a representative from the IBEW, because as the charter is written, that's a person appointed by the IBEW to represent the IBEW. Well, if there's no union workers, it's somewhat redundant. So I want to make that notice as well so people know about it. But to that end, I won't be around to set up the PA system. And that leads to the discussion that we had with Kate in the minutes. It's my personal opinion that we should not be adding that duty to the duty of the state nuclear engineer. Tony is our nuclear engineer. He's not our admin person. If he was, he'd be taking minutes. And again, regardless of whether or not Tony is willing to take on the duty, I think the panel needs to discuss and hopefully agree that that's not a duty that belongs to the state nuclear engineer, and we need to either revise the contract for BCT to take it on, or deal with it otherwise without it becoming a additional ancillary duty of Mr. Washinsky.
Any comments from anybody else?
We did discuss this when we were up in Montpelier, and it just seems like the obvious choice would be that BCTV would just go that extra step, since they're here anyway, they're documenting every month, that they would be the one to also arrange the sound system, and I'm sure they'd be thrilled to do so. So I would, I would make a motion to ask BCTV to take over that role potentially, if they could give us a cost estimate. You're shaking your head.
I'm shaking my head because it's an issue that is a contractual issue that would have to be addressed. They can't just take it over. We have to make sure that the BCTV is able and is willing and contractually can support it.
Yes. If they were able and willing, I would make a motion that we should ask them and see how much it's going to cost.
Thank you. So I think there are a few things I need to say here. One is this is not something that we can just do by motion, I don't think. Representative Dean, my good friend, used a very strong word just a moment ago. He said it was at my pleasure that the panel would have resources, and that's not fair. The statute doesn't use the word pleasure. The statute does give me the authority to authorize the expenditure of funds for purposes of maintaining this panel's business. For some of the newer members here, you're perhaps not aware of the $1.2 million deficit that my agency is facing. I would like to sit here tonight and say that I have good news and that that problem has been solved, but it has not. So it's not like we have a lot of resources at our disposal. Another complicating factor is that I think in the sands of time, a few things have gotten lost. And one is that there was a time when Vermont Yankee, the site proper, was owned by CVPS and GMP. And so there was a direct nexus to costs that those utilities incurred and costs that were passed on to ratepayers. And when the plant was sold to Entergy, Entergy was a merchant generator, not a public service utility regulated by the state of Vermont as such. The implications of that are that Entergy has not paid gross receipts tax on its earnings from selling power, to my knowledge at least, whereas the CVPS and GMP owners did pay gross receipts tax. And what that meant was, as you perhaps are aware, the gross receipts tax funds my department. And so Entergy for years has been involved in a variety of regulatory proceedings, almost all of which I think have been conducted on a contested case basis. And therefore, the expenditures there have been billed back to Entergy. But Entergy has not otherwise been contributing to my department's budget. And when this panel was created and that authority that Representative Dean grossly mischaracterized as my pleasure, when that authority was created, I don't think, I could be wrong, but I don't think thought was given to that. And so every dime that is spent on Endicap is money that's actually coming from Vermont ratepayers, but not from Entergy, or in this case, North Star, if the transaction goes through. So the nexus there has been lost, and I'm concerned about it. To get more to the point of what we're going to do about the audiovisual system and the like, as much as I appreciate your desire to protect my nuclear engineer, that is my decision, not the panel's. And it has to be made on the basis of what we can afford. So certainly I think it's a good idea to look into what it would cost to see if we could contract this out, much as we do the minutes. But looking into that is not a commitment to doing it. It may well be that we have to continue to use the resources that are available to us, as the panel has successfully been doing for the past several years. And I think I speak for everybody here in expressing dismay at the task of filling Kate's shoes somehow. She has held together many duties and many demanding duties, and done so in an exemplary way, and that is not something that is easily replaced. And in my experience, when moments like this are reached, it is sometimes a call to reorganize how things are done, as opposed to simply assuming that we're going to find one person who will step in and take Kate's role over. Those are my comments.
So as a fairly new member, I guess, Kate, I have a question. So do we have any kind of a annual process where we talk about any resources that the committee will need on an annual basis? Is there, in fact, something that we could point to and say, you know, I mean, I've heard Lissa and others talk about the need, and I don't necessarily disagree with the work that to potentially think about compensating the chair. Is that written down somewhere? Has that been articulated? Because that to me seems like the place we really probably need to start.
I think we have this discussion at least once a year, if not more often than that. And both Commissioner Recchia and Commissioner Tierney have, expressed the same thing. There isn't any money set aside for this. And it's usually the discussions we have are in the context of what if we want to get an expert in. And both Commissioner Tierney and Commissioner Recchia previously said, well, if you want somebody, tell me how much it's going to cost. I can't promise you, but if we can do it, we will. So it's really, the discussions have been in the context of getting experts in. We did have a discussion because first Tony was doing the meeting minutes and then I was doing the meeting minutes, and I basically went on strike when Chris Recchia was commissioner and said, it's ridiculous. I have a job and a life and I can't do meeting minutes. And that's when we contracted with someone, because Chris Recchia could see me like jumping off a building. So there are these issues that we talk about, we've never really addressed them. And as I said, Tony and I have this giant spreadsheet which I'm going to send to everybody on the panel so that everybody really understands how we've been surviving. And I think there's, I don't know how many people actually know that David gets here. He doesn't just, the sound system isn't here. He goes and picks it up and brings it over and then takes it down and brings it back. So there are all these issues that have been sort of building up that we really haven't addressed. Like, I know what they are, down to the, typing up the nameplates kind of thing. So I think this is, as June just said, we're sort of forced, I think, now to say, is it what I don't think what we've been doing is working, but does everybody else think that it's working? And if it isn't working, how can we fix it? And it is also a discussion, I think, going forward of what's the role of the panel. For the last 4 years, we've had a lot of discussions, and now we're coming to a point where if there is a sale, what does it look like, going forward? What are the issues that need to be addressed going forward? So it's like an organizational issue, who does what, and then it's also maybe there needs to be an opportunity to step back and say, what are the issues this panel should be addressing? I don't know if that answers your question, but that's sort of where I see things.
So it's helpful. So I guess we're now at a place where we need to be thinking about what the next year may bring. I personally am of the opinion some panel of this type needs to continue, at least until, the transfer and decommissioning is complete, just to, maybe frequent, but.
Yeah, and the state statute requires 4 meetings a year. And for the people that were on from the very beginning, there was a point where we were pretty much meeting every month except July and August. And that may not be necessary, once this, but I don't want to make that judgment on behalf of the whole panel. But, I think there's a turning point for that can happen, and there can be some like self-assessment, by the panel.
And so, sticking on this, is there an annual process where we kind of chart out the year's work? And if not, it seems like this might be a great time right now to talk about, is there a group of people who might want to bring something like that to the next meeting?
Yes. This is sort of what I was hoping for when we put this on, that this is a time to really reflect upon this, talk about it, again at the June meeting. And because I should have looked at this, but I think there's a job, sometimes people are appointed and it's like till your successor is named. I do believe in the appointments of the citizen members, by the President Pro Tem, the Speaker, and the Governor. It's a drop dead, like August 30th date. So there's a drop dead date here that somebody has to lead the chair.
Why don't we speak to the point here, which is I don't think you are offering to be the chair beyond that date, right?
Well, my appointment is up then, and I'm not going to ask, I'm going to beg the governor not to reappoint me, so I won't be here after August 30th.
So why don't we accept that very difficult fact right now, instead of having one of these things where you backpedal from what you're doing, and we then beg you on bended knee to please don't leave us. We're not going to do that, right? Okay.
Yeah. So I would like to suggest that we form a small group to work with Kate and, or however that works, Kate, whatever your recommendation, to come back with some recommendations at the next meeting. And I would love to not be on that, but I will be if it's necessary.
Okay.
But I would love to not be on it.
I think it's pretty clear from the statute that I have obligations here, so I'm clearly on that meeting, in that group.
I really think that the Issues Committee, which has almost been an ad hoc committee, but the membership has been pretty steady in terms of who's there. The work that the Issue Committee has done has been narrower, more narrow, more focused, more weeds as opposed to forest. But there's no reason that that Issues Committee cannot take on a forest perspective and address the issues that Representative Sebelius brought up and Kate has brought up in terms of putting together an agenda with maybe some advisors and whatever, to have that discussion, to structure that discussion, and to lead somewhere. You know, I've been at all, well, most, if not all, of the Issue Committee meetings, and it's just always been that there's enough specific activities that have driven what that committee has recommended that the full panel takes on, that we haven't taken that step back. But there's no reason we can't. So I would suggest that the chair ask the Issues Committee to convene at least once between now and the June meeting and maybe bring something back.
Could I just weigh in on that for a moment? Because I like the direction that your thinking is taking, but I think Kate has teed up a moment for us to step back and think differently about this. I have not been to an Issues Committee meeting, and I frankly don't know who serves on the committee off the top of my head. Judging certainly by the topics that the panel has occupied itself with in the year and a half that I've been on it, that committee must be very functional because they've done a superb job of identifying issues. But what we're talking about here is a combination of mission and logistics analysis. And I don't think that is really something that can be appropriately delegated to a subset unless, I guess, the committee chooses to do so, at which point I would urge that we think about the membership of that committee a little more instead of just, unless the Issues Committee has just consisted of those folks who are regularly most able to focus on the substantive work of the committee. This goes beyond substance. This goes to the essence of what this panel sees itself doing going forward. I would just add a couple of my own observations to that. I'm very mindful of my statutory duties here in terms of providing resources and the like, so that should be a given that that's one role or one consideration for us to have in mind. But I also think that the committee could stand to take some time to think what the scope, what the reasonable scope is of this committee going forward. I agree that the transfer, if it is approved, certainly for the foreseeable years, will keep the committee busy. But I don't know that it need to do so at the pace of meeting a month, except for June and August. And I think it's a little like other things I see going on in the state. This committee has done quality work, but you just heard Kate say the way we've been doing it doesn't work. And I wonder how many other committee members beside myself hear that and are surprised to hear it. I have no problem recognizing that it must be true because Kate said so, but that is revelation. And if that is how the person or the persons, if I add Tony and Dave into the equation, feel about what it has meant to carry the logistical burden of the process that we've had, we need to pay attention to that. And I think the fact that nobody has jumped forward and said, let me be it, speaks volumes. And I personally have to say that I see a trimmer operation in our future because we can't always do what we can't afford. And what I'm getting out of Kate's comment is that we have been living on her goodwill for a very long time. And we cannot continue to do that. And I know that I don't have bags of money back in Montpelier that will fund this operation if we were to professionalize it.
So there's a few things. One is that I guess in the memorandum of understanding, and we have representatives from the New England Coalition here, there was some mention of North Star's commitment to an ongoing citizens grouping, and at least in our discussions, Clay or Skylar or one of you, please chime in. There was a conception that this would be separate from NDCAP, or potentially a committee under this committee. And I'm just wondering, is this an opportunity potentially, because the sale hasn't gone through, to try to put the touch on North Star to potentially help fund the ongoing work of our committee? And could it be something that happens that way? You're party to the MOU, so, or maybe you, June, know more about that.
I can speak to the issue from the department's perspective, and I can say that that MOU is pending approval right now, and so I don't see how we move to change it. That would be out of order in a proceeding of the nature that's pending. That said, I think it's an interesting opening and one that shouldn't require, at least I wouldn't think in the first instance, resort to legal obligation to make the overture and to see if there's good corporate citizenship willingness on North Star's part. But as the designated representative tonight of my agency, I must urge the committee to recall that that transaction has not been consummated. The Public Utilities Commission has not yet ruled, and so it would be premature to start leaning on that.
Thank you. I would also point out that research I did in the past indicated that in Canada, these kinds of citizens committees are funded by the government, and in other countries too, I suspect. So it is a practice, and that our role is recognized as a necessary one. And I've been aware of Kate's incredible contribution, and Kate is a very unique person. I think it's going to be very, very hard to fill her shoes. If I was to speculate on another committee member that I personally would like to see chair the committee, it would probably be Chris Campany. However, Chris Campany is an extremely busy individual, and there would need probably to be some form of compensation. That said, legislation's meant to be revisited too, and maybe there is a role for Laura to introduce new legislation in the next legislature that would potentially get some funding to this panel. So that would be another thing. And just to Dave's point about the International Brotherhood no longer being represented, but surely there will be workers as part of, again, whether or not the sale goes through, if it's North Star's workers or whatever, there'll still be potentially a role for having a workers representative on the panel, wouldn't you think?
Well, we're bound by the statute as it exists right now, so if the legislature was to change the enabling legislation, then that could be revisited, but it is what it is at the moment.
I see.
I want to follow up on some of the commissioners' remarks and gets a little fuzzy up there for me once in a while. Are you telling me that the administration will not include or consider including financial assistance for the decommissioning panel as part of a budget request? Just so I have it clearly stated.
I seem to remember walking in here tonight and you making some gesture to me about how you were going to be friendly.
Yeah, I know. I just couldn't help myself, though.
There you go, putting on that face that you put on in Montpelier, and you've used it on me before.
And I am
been before your
addressing
committee.
my remarks to all three agencies that are sitting at the table. All right?
Indeed.
The legislature has asked the DPS, in particular, in the existing legislation, to provide support for this panel. It was not defined what that is. We have been asking various commissioners since we've been in place for financial assistance, and everybody has sort of slipped and slided, and it's never been forthcoming. So I just want to make it a black and white issue. That if you want to go off and think about it and come back and talk with the panel, that's fine too. I'm not looking to force the issue right now, but at some point, without administration support, introducing legislation is a vacant gesture. All right, as we are finding out in terms of what is going on in Montpelier as we speak. All right, there may be as many as a dozen bills that will be vetoed for various reasons that the administration does not agree with what the legislature has put out there. What I would like to do going in, because the work of this panel in this situation is so important, is to build an administrative and legislative partnership? Gee, what a notion. And to get some resources behind this panel to do some of the work that we've been talking about.
There are a couple of thoughts that come to mind, sir. One is that the statute in two different places speaks to resources. In subsection 1702, it says that the Department of Public Service, the Agency of Human Services, and the Agency of Natural Resources shall furnish administrative support to the panel with assistance from the owners of VYMPS as the Commissioner of Public Service may consider appropriate. So to be clear there already is a mechanism for administrative support as I, in my judgment, find appropriate. So that's item one.
Right, and you and I both know that support is a matter of resources, capacity.
That's correct.
And that in order for there to be adequate resources, capacity available in your department or the Department of Health or whomever,
Agency of Natural Resources,
it takes a budget request, it takes money. And
I'm going to stick with the statutory language, administrative support. That's item one. Item two, I haven't slunk or slithered or done anything whatsoever when it's come to this issue. Those were your words a moment ago, or to that effect. I've been very clear with this panel at all times about where I stood about providing resources. The last time that we discussed this, it was in the context of potentially hiring experts to advise this panel in the litigation that my department, along with the Agency of Natural Resources and the Department of Health, was representing the state and the people in. And that is a very different conversation to my mind. As I recall, a principal concern I had was the potential duplication of efforts, because I saw no reason why the state and its experts could not capably represent the interests, and I urged this panel to do what it could to advise us, as you so capably have. That's a very
Well,
different,
that-
that is a very
the
different, I'm
expertise
speaking right
question-
now, sir.
the
It is a very
expertise
different
question
conversation
is
from whether we're going to
separate
give you money from this
conversation.
panel. And you have tried to put me on the spot this evening about whether the administration will or will not support one thing, which I'm not prepared to speak to tonight.
Well, I said, you
No.
can come back and talk with us or the panel at any point. You didn't need to address it tonight.
Well, you can't have it both ways. You can't say you want a black and white answer and then tell me I can come back later. It's one or the other, sir.
No, you can give a black or white answer at any time. And so I would be really curious whether or not we can count on support for the panel.
I think we're going to have to deal with the statutory language as to what is possible, and I would note that a lot of that is reserved to my discretion. And if that makes the panel uncomfortable, then I think we are back to whether Representative Sibilia perhaps ought to introduce legislation, which I don't see at all as an empty gesture. Quite to the contrary.
And maybe this will help or won't help. Again, Tony and I have put together an Excel spreadsheet of the different tasks and who has been doing them. And because I was really busy, I didn't have a chance to actually look at it. That's why you don't have it tonight. But I think I'm going to email it out to everybody, and that may help sort of gel what support is needed moving forward. I think that might help the conversation. And I can get that out in the next couple of days, and then we can have it and discuss it at the June meeting. I mean, I think that will help when you see what it is. And there may be, I don't know, creative ways to do it. But that may help.
Yeah. I am more than happy to introduce changes in legislation if they're needed, but again, I think this kind of crystallizing, this group leaving here, kind of talking about what is needed at least in the next year. I'm feeling a sense of urgency about that, so I'm happy to attend such a meeting to listen.
Great. And I actually agree with what June said about mission and logistics, because I think that's what we need to really be figuring out. And then when you know the mission and the logistics, then the agenda items can follow what it is the bigger mission of this panel is going to be. So does anyone else have any comments, or do people want to volunteer to be on this committee or attend a meeting, as Laura said she would, and Commissioner Tierney?
I hope that someone from Vernon would attend the meeting, at least.
Vernon?
I volunteer.
Who is that? Well, I want to make sure we know we have a group of people. You know, we'll figure out who the group is, and then I'll let everybody know, and anybody who wants to come to a meeting can come. I'm afraid if we don't decide who it is, I'll be sitting alone in my office. And I know Chris Campney, we could get him to be on it, because he's been thinking a lot about that. Yeah.
I volunteer to be on it too. I think it's very important. I'm very concerned because we are going into a potential transition and a very active time, and there's going to be a lot of hours put in if we're going to do our jobs. And I think administrative support, as Commissioner Tierney pointed to the legislative language, there is a need for more administrative support if Kate is stepping away potentially, and we'll just have to figure that out. But I would love to meet maybe within the next month.
Yeah. Chris. It's June it's the fourth Thursday, which I think is the 28th. June 28th.
I would also say that the reason I brought up including some mention of this issue in the annual report to the legislature is because we might need to go back to them, and it would be nice to have had some reference to the ongoing discussion of this, which has occurred year upon year, and to not sort of mention that that's been an issue in the functioning of the panel in the 2017 minutes basically means that it didn't happen or that it wasn't important enough to include. And the reason I brought it up is because I think it is important enough to include. But again, I defer to you, Kate, on that matter.
Right now, we have as volunteers, we've self-volunteered Chris Campney. We have Lissa, Commissioner Tierney, Representative Sibilia, I'll be on it. And I don't know, Michael, yes. Yeah, we'll put you on. And then, does anyone else want to be an official member? David Andrews is being really quiet, but you know what's going on, so I'm wondering, we'll inform you when the meeting is.
Yeah, I don't have to volunteer. You know I'll be there.
Yeah. Yeah. And what we'll do is we'll figure out amongst this group of people when we can have a meeting, either people in person and people on the phone, and then I'll make sure everybody else knows so other people can join in as they are able or want to, if that sounds okay with everybody. And in the next couple of days, I'll send around an Excel spreadsheet. I think that will focus people on what we're exactly talking about. Any last issues on that one? All right, now it's time in the meeting for public comment. And I don't know if there's anyone in, I know Carol Levin wants to say something. And Carol, even though we know who you are, will you tell us who you are and where you're from for the viewing audience?
Sure. I'm Carol Levin. I now live in Brattleboro, Vermont. And I would like to thank every member of this committee for all your showing up, participation, ideas, suggestions. I think it's been incredible. Incredibly helpful for us as the public to know what's going on and on a month-to-month basis. And so I thank you all, and I do hope that this committee continues in some reasonable form. My one real thought, however, is I think there isn't anybody in this room or in this community that knows and deals with this subject on a regular basis that has any confidence that this interim storage will be interim, because it's not going to be interim. It's certainly not going to be 20 years. It probably not be 100 years. It might be 1,000 years. It might be forever. This waste is here to stay. And my concern is that it was set up to be interim when it's never been intended to be interim at all. And I think that's a real problem. And I think that's really the elephant in the room right now. But I thank you all for your participation and all the public for coming as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Is there anyone else in the public that would like to make a comment at this time?
Can I ask a member of the public to make a comment? I don't know if that's unorthodox, but I'm sitting here looking at Clay Turnbull, and I'm just curious because you discussed briefly. We had a discussion. What is your understanding of what North Star and Entergy agreed to in terms of this citizens? Is it different than INDICAP, or what was it? The new panel, the panel that would include NEC, basically. Thank you, Clay.
I think I'd be advised to say that the MOU needs to speak for itself as it's written. I think I would be advised by the legal folks that it wouldn't be right to speak for or against any aspect of the MOU. And
Can you at least tell us what the language is regarding this new group or a group?
no, not off the top of my head. I mean, it calls for citizen, stakeholder participation. Yeah. I think it's sufficiently vague that you would be frustrated to not know nitty-gritty details, but that's the way it is.
Okay. All right, well, thank you for showing,
It's all right. It's all right.
trying.
So, Madam Chair, I apologize for, I think I'm out of order at this point, but I would request special privilege. I am newly reminded under Title 18, Section 17, C of the following language. The Commissioner of Public Service, that would be me, shall serve as the chair until the panel elects a chair or co-chairs under subsection D of this section. Subsection D in turn reads, the panel annually shall elect a chair or co-chairs and a vice chair for one-year terms commencing with its first meeting following the effective date of this section. So I think that should help to relieve some of the tension that we may be feeling about what is going to happen when you turn into a pumpkin on August 31st, was it? There we go. So have no fear, there will be leadership. It may not be good, but you'll have it. And I would just close that comment by noting a piece of history. Before the NDCAP was formed, there was a panel called the VSNAP, and I'm sure Senator McDonald has fond memories of VSNAP. It may be there are other panel members here tonight, including Representative Dean, I think. I didn't mean to yell at you, I'm sorry. You know that Susan Small here is here, and she'll write a story about us, and it's going to be about verbal fisticuffs that we had. So I'm apologizing to you now because I hope she's right that part too. She always writes about you, and you always have the white hat, and I always have the black hat. Anyway, back to my history lesson. VSNAP, at least to my knowledge, was characterized by a fair amount of contentiousness. And as I recall, one of my predecessors chaired those meetings. And I think that this language here in the statute was inserted in recognition that, particularly given the resource role that I play, along with my colleagues from the Agency of Natural Resources and Department of Public Health, I see my friendly colleague here from the Agency of Commerce who happily reminded me that she does not have such a role. Anyway, I think it's pretty clear that the panel prospers when somebody other than the commissioner is running it. So I would urge my fellow members to keep that in mind.
Yeah, that was a very active discussion when this panel was first brought together, and it was decided by all in attendance that someone other than an agency representative should be chair of the panel, and the best of all possible worlds, that it would be a citizen representative, not even a legislative representative, but a citizen.
I understand you're retiring. It seems to me you have superb meeting skills. You've chaired a committee, as I recall, and done so very well for a very long time, too. So, anybody else for David Dean for chair?
He's got Chad to catch.
Is there any more public comment? Before we go, Bill, are you still on the phone?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Go
ahead.
I don't want to put you on the spot. There was I think we've sort of lost track of stuff, but there was talk of going up to the state lab, and you had arranged for that. And
Yes, that's what I wanted to talk about. It was for May 29th.
yes, and I think it's, I don't know if anybody on the panel is able to go. I don't know if, Bill, if you want to give a brief what this would be about, what the trip would be about.
Well,
Or what
to
they
be
would
honest
see.
with you, it was the Issues Committee that asked me to see if I could make arrangements for it, as opposed to me bringing it to you folks. I was asked to find a date that the lab could accommodate a tour. I could venture to say that the lab processes all of the environmental samples that the state obtains around Vermont Yankee, and we could therefore see the laboratory, we could discuss the sampling, we could discuss other aspects of environmental surveillance. But I don't know if the Issues Committee had something further beyond that.
So yeah, this is, hi Bill, it's David. This has been discussed for quite a while. So I guess the question at this point is, we have a tentative date, but is there interest on behalf of any panelists to come up and actually see the lab? If there's an interest, and if you're available, then we can ink that in. If not, we can do it another date. So I guess I'll look across the panel and ask, is there people available and interested on May 29th to travel up to see the state's lab?
I would love to go visit the lab, but I could not do it on May 29th. It's just too short notice.
I can tell you that the lab is an ongoing concern and will be available essentially indefinitely. So if the panel were to identify a different month whereby to do this, we could make those arrangements, and they would be glad to work within their calendar to make arrangements to host the panel for a tour.
Bill, that sounds like the way to go at this point.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll let them know that we're not going to do it next Tuesday, and that there may be an opportunity to set a new date in the future.
With our thanks.
Yeah, that's great. Before we adjourn, does anyone else on the panel have anything that they want to bring up? If not, our next meeting's be June 28th. And do we know, Tony, exactly where it's going to be yet?
We were looking at the Hunt House. Joe, I don't know if you've gotten final word on that. And we have potentially the middle school as an alternate site, but I'm still waiting on final word for that.
Okay, so we do have a meeting site. It'll either be Vernon or Brattleboro, and we'll keep people posted. Would anyone like to make a motion to adjourn? We have about 10 motions to adjourn. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Anyone opposed? Thanks, everybody.